The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good evening, Othmar, and good morning to all the rest of you. Good evening to those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, and good morning to our friends in Australia and New Zealand. How's the sound, folks? Can you all hear me all right? Somebody just type in the questions box, if you would, that the audio is good. Yes, all good. Oh, Peter. Janet, hello, darling. John Barnes, Mark Andrew. Oh, lots of people here. Mark. Don Maydell up in Canada. Great to have all of you with us, folks. I'm glad you can hear me. Let's see all our friends who are here today. Okay, let's see who we've got. All the usual crowd as usual. Got a good roll up today. Adrian Pitt, haven't heard from you for a long time. Nice to see you, mate. Akshay, he's a very old member, been with us for years and years. Albert, Alex, yes, hello, Alex Shakarupa. Yes, we know about Alex. Nice to see you with us. Brian up in Weewar. Hope you got the good rain up there, mate. I suppose you got a ton of it. Chase, yes, Chase, nice to have you with me. Chris, Daniel, Darren Lorraine, Daryl and Sage over in New Zealand. Great supporters of ours, great traders. David Volk done a tutorial, knows all about trading now, as does Don Maydell and Eric Trotter up in Dubai. Hugh Sinclair, hello Hugh. James, John, Janet, hello Janet. Another Janet, Janet Rivette, Johnny Barnes, yes. Mac Cutchins, Mac, I hope you're feeling better up there, mate. You should be recovering now. I hope you are. My friend Marcel up in Canada, good to have you with us, Marcel. Mark Lister, yeah, hello, Mark, good to have you with us down in Melbourne. Plenty of others, goodness me. Matty Corbett, hello, good to have all the mates here. Marilyn, happy to have you with us. Mike Murphy, good, nice, he's done a tutorial. Peter Andrews, the first bloke I ever taught the Daniel Code to, still with us today, going strong. Peter, hope you're well, matey. Peter Batayard, he's a new tutorial guy. Rob H, my mate from New Zealand, he's a great trader. He's a great analyst as well. Rolf, good to have you. Oh, lots and lots of people. Sue, hello, Sue Lee. Always have to say, particularly, and Vicky Butterworth, have to particularly say hello to all the ladies because we don't have many of them. They're a very precious commodity. That's kind of weird, isn't it? Because, Forex trading, for example, in Japan, where it's all the rage, is largely dominated by ladies, but we don't sort of have a huge membership of ladies. In fact, very few, so we welcome thee all. Nice to have you all. And, of course, William Ford Wills sent me the link on the cash funds in America, William, which I had read. Great to see that you're onto that. We're going to talk about that as well. So welcome, everyone. Good to have you all with us. Please, Max says he's a bit better. I hope so, old fella. You've had a rough trot. Guys and gals, just type any questions you have into the questions box and I'll deal with them when we get to the end of it. So pretty special webinar today because you're going to hear me do a lot of talking because I'm starting for the first time since the bottom of this market in 2009 to get a little bit concerned about markets and their future direction, and in that I mean particularly the equities markets and the bond market. We're going to have a little bit of a think about what are the reasons to start being a little bit more alert. Markets, basically, equity markets are hugely overvalued. They've got to these valuations largely on the basis of very, very low interest rates, Fed policy, and just loose money generally, active boosting by the Fed of US markets, which lead the world and are very much mirrored in some of the other markets, equities we look at. Stretch valuations. There just simply must be a point at which it's impossible to go on believing. I know the trend is your friend until it ends, and the trend is certainly up and has been since 2009. We've had one warning signal, which I talked to you about a number of weeks ago now, I want to talk today to you about some of the other issues, the more the nuttier, grunty, the big issues that are affecting us. And I'm going to talk to you quite a bit today about Australia. It's not because I am Australian or that I'm particularly interested in Australian markets or Australian economy, but that the figures out of the US are just so massive that they're meaningless. The human brain just can't comprehend the dollar figures involved in the US economy. Mine can't at any rate. So if you want to tell me I've got a small mind, you're probably right. But I'm going to use Australia as an example because it's very much this would same would apply to New Zealand, Pete, for you folks over there, and Daryl and Sage. These are countries, Australia and New Zealand, that are very affluent. They're sort of middling socialist type countries, and they very high tax regimes. Australia more so than New Zealand, and there's just a great deal of trouble brewing. The law of gravity hasn't been repealed. Markets just can't go up and up forever. When they're at highly inflated levels as they are now, it's momentum that keeps them going. It's the bigger fool theory. You got to buy now or it'll be higher tomorrow. And that's pretty much what drives the property markets. And they're at nosebleed levels now. The average price in Sydney, let me tell you, average, think of what you get for the average, is now approaching $1 million. Absolutely absurd. It's a bit crazy everywhere, folks, and it's getting crazier. But I think it's at risk now, and I wanted to share this with you. So let's start looking at some of the things we've got here for you today. Let's move on to our first slide of the day, and let me make sure this has changed for you so you can see it. Yes, you can, and I've called this Houston, we have a problem. Pretty much we can summarize all those problems, or at least where they come from, in just a few points. Central banks, that's the US Fed. In Australia and New Zealand, it's the reserve banks. In Europe, it's not so much the countries' central banks as the ECB, the European Central Bank. Tony, screamy Chicago, screamy, is it? Yeah, the ECB, and of course, China. Wow, what a problem there. And the problem is debt, and strangely enough, the problem is also income. The sort of cure for this, the will of the people, the will of the populace to allow corrections to be made to the mad spending boom we've had for the last decade, lies with the media and also with politicians. And we're just going to talk about that a little bit as we go on. See if I can find where I've got my mad cat out there making noises. Don't ever get a Siamese, folks. I have a Siamese and another one who's a refugee from the RSPCA. Sage, I know you and Daryl have the beautiful Siamese as well. But the problem with Siamese, they're very vocal, and when they want something, they certainly let you know, and they're no respecters of persons. Let's talk a little bit about the central banks. You probably read a lot about central banks. There's a great deal of vitriol and hatred, particularly in America, directed towards the US Fed. It's not such a hot topic anywhere else apart from Germany, which is trying to keep a conservative lid on public expenditure, and the ECB, the overarching central bank for the European Union, is trying to model itself on the Fed a bit, the whatever it takes attitude. And whatever it takes is a great attitude when things have to be done, but it should also come with the realization that the money they're spending is not theirs, it's the taxpayers, and at some stage one hopes that the taxpayers are going to get that money back. And of course the true answer is they're not. This debt crisis fueled by the central banks that control money supply and interest rates, it's so far gone now. You're starting to scratch your head and say, how can we see a way back? How can a rational person, I'm not talking about all the hysterics who like to write articles that grab lots of headlines, but a normal, rational person, it's time for us all to think about how much this debt binge has got out of control, how poorly allocated it is, because it always goes to the big end of town, and you and I certainly don't benefit from it. And of course, the interest rate thing is that interest rates now have got so low in developed countries that they're wasted as a source of ammunition for central banks. In America, it's down to 0 to 0.5%, the official interest rate. In Australia, 1.5%. New Zealand, 2%. And the point is that there's nobody out there saying, I'm not going to start a business until interest rates fall another quarter point. The incentive, the stimulatory effect of lower interest rates is largely gone. And these ideas of negative interest rates, they're a piece of sophistry by economists and banking gurus, but the reality is they're just the tail of an idea that's been overused and gone too far. So the big ammunition, they stimulate the economy with massive injections of liquidity and reductions in interest rates when things are going badly, when recession threatens. That's largely gone. There's still the capacity to inject massive amounts of money, but essentially central banks and governments have been doing that for the last 8 to 10 years. And all it's done is blow bigger bubbles. So money supply and interest rates no longer have that bite. And they're the key tools that bankers, central bankers, and governments rely on. And they've spent that. They've spent the money. They still have unlimited money if they want to, pump more into the economy. But it's these interest rates that are doing the damage now, that interest rates are now effectively so low that there's no capacity to reduce them further. And should they reduce them further, it's unlikely, very unlikely to have any stimulatory effect. So that major tool is gone. So it's the growth in the money supply, lax lending standards, policy towards bank reserves and interest rates that have led to the debt problem. You can see certainly in our part of the world, Australia, I think, now has the most expensive real estate in the world. We're mimicking the property boom that went on in the States in 2007. This is all, nothing happens by accident. The point we have to all remember is that markets don't make moves by accident. We've got the usual foundations of supply and demand. We've got the softs, the commodities that are affected by weather and shortages and what have you. But these big markets, interest rate markets, equities and what have you, they're affected by government policies. And so is the real estate market. For example, in Australia and New Zealand, the Reserve Bank sets the amount of reserves that banks have to hold for each type of lending. So if they're lending on commercial deals, they have to have a certain percent of that as reserves. When you get to real estate, they have to have literally none. It's close enough. It's a few percentage points is all the reserves that the banks have to make. So the profit they're making from that sort of lending, real estate lending, is virtually all cop to them. And that's why this property boom is going on. The banks are motivated, in fact, they're incentivized by the Reserve Bank to lend more and more money on property transactions. And it's got to the stage now that in the major cities, first home buyers are largely priced out of the market. Those that are in the market are going to be under a great deal of mortgage stress. And any downturn in these property markets is going to be fatal for a whole lot of people. and that's the point to remember. This is not happening by accident. It's motivated. Now, who are the people who can fix this problem? Well, basically, it's the politicians. We have this amazing debt load in every country in the developed world, and more in China. And who are the people who can fix it? Well, it's the politicians, and they're not going to fix it. And quite simply, their real statements are, we all know how to fix the problems. The real problem is we don't know how to get re-elected after we make the fix. And, we just see this all the time. Remember, politicians have fairly short time cycles. They're elected for either 3 or 4 years, and they hope to be re-elected again. And they're just not going to have the courage to bite into the real problems that we have, which is profligate spending, a massive, massive welfare system in all our countries. You couldn't call the US or really a socialist country, but its welfare bill is massive. Australia and New Zealand are semi-socialist. They are, in effect, socialist countries. The total outlays on welfare is 1/3 of all expenditure. It's just massive. How do you deal with that issue? You can't cut back spending in any real sense without getting a blitz from the electorate, getting a blitz from the media. Very much dominated by populist media, liberal media, if you like. And I'm going to give you some examples of that, silly examples. The question is, what's in the best interest of the politicians? Their self-interest, getting re-elected, or tackling these really, really gnarly problems, which involve, realistically, latest independent report on the Australian economy. Again, I'm only using Australia as a smaller example because it at least has numbers that you can contemplate, whereas when we talk about the US economy, the European economy, the numbers are just so huge that it's impossible to get your head around it. The latest independent report says Australia's effectively got to get rid of $70 billion worth of debt to get its budget back on a sound trajectory. Now, remember, these are AAA rated countries. I know America's lost its AAA rating, but it's the most AAA of them all in reality. That was just S&P and Moody having a tantrum about something. Australia and New Zealand still have their AAA ratings, but Australia's got to get rid of $70 billion worth of debt. At the moment, this new government that's in hanging by its fingernails is trying to bring through an omnibus bill to get rid of $6.5 billion worth of debt and can't get it through the parliament. So, I mean, they can't even attack 10%, and that's not going to do it. The ongoing gifting by politicians of favours, of benefits, has just over the years just ramped up and up and up. And it's always going the same way. So it's an old saying in racing, always back self-interest, at least you know it's trying. That's the case with politicians. Always assume that they'll do what's in their own best interest, like the rest of the human race. And my little note at the bottom is, thank you for your service. Please don't vomit. I mean, I'm perpetually amused by these politicians farewelling other politicians who've had their snouts in the public trough forever. Most of them never had a working job in their lives. And you've got politicians saying to each other, thank you for your service. What service? The service of robbing the taxpayers, basically. Have you noticed how all politicians, male and female, seem to get a lot better dressed when they're in office? All of a sudden, they're getting noticed as seeing all the new people going into Parliament. All of a sudden, they have better clothes, and obviously they're all overpaid and underworked. But that's not the problem. The problem is that they have no self-interest. They have no commitment to doing the things that we know has to be done. Now let's have a look at this story about debt that most of you know about, the horror stories from Greece, Italy, and the troubled banks in the southern EU, many of whom are insolvent. China is literally a debt bubble on top of a debt bubble. There's no transparency on that, on the massive government corporations that are essentially zombies. But even a little country like Australia, 24 million people, we're paying 40 million per day in interest on our government debt, and it's considered to be manageable, sustainable, and one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the OECD. I mean, it's crazy when you think about it, absolutely crazy. And then we keep getting the argument, which I'm sure you hear in all of your countries every day. Money is cheap. Government should borrow to spend, but don't forget a big part of that spending goes on public service salaries, subsidies to inefficient industries. Dairy's the latest. Steel, as for years and years, steel prices have collapsed all over the world, but not in Australia or New Zealand, where the subsidies enable the steel companies to maintain prices that are completely out of context with the rest of the world, with what's actually happening in world markets. I understand the problems in the dairy industry. They're having a couple of bad years, so, they put their hand out for a handout from government. But, of course, government doesn't have any money. These handouts that they're talking about are just taxpayers' money that you and I have paid that are being diverted to other industries. So why should we be subsidising dairy farmers when they're having a bad couple of years? They've had the richest, most profitable years they've ever had prior to the last 2 years. They didn't put anything aside from that. They certainly didn't give a subsidy to you or me or anyone else. But when things go bad, we got to bail them out. Why? It's a social problem. It's what the liberal media love. There are a whole lot of people engaged in this industry, and we have an obligation to support them, to keep them on their farms. I just don't see that. I've never seen it. But that's the mentality. I guess there's a lot of votes in dairy, which is why the National Party, the country party, if you like, jumps up and down and pushes this. But it's just a handout from taxpayers to an industry that is hugely profitable most of the time. And don't forget, for all farmers, dairy farmers in particular, they're not really looking so much at their year-to-year profitability. They've got this massive capital gain. Pete Andrews in New Zealand's the expert on this. Massive, massive capital gain. Dairy farms now, the price of dairy farms is like gold. It's just through the stratosphere. That's never taken into account when we get the questions about the bailout. Let's bail out these farmers. Let's give them a handout. Let's give them it's a subsidy. You can call it government loans with loose terms and loose repayments. Effectively, it's a subsidy. So it's a more taxpayer money. And what's it do? It adds debt. Those of you who don't know, we actually had an Aussie Prime Minister called Tony Abbott, who tried during the last Parliament to rein in this debt. He brought in legislation that raised fees in a lot of categories, raised petrol taxes, raised cigarette taxes, asked people to make a contribution to our free health system, he was chucked out of office. I'm not defending him. A lot of what he did was not too smart and not too sensitive, because the Liberal Party, which is not liberal for those of you from overseas, the Liberal Party in Australia are the Conservatives. The Labor Party are the left-wing Workers' Party. But the Liberal Party and the Labor Party are basically twins, save and except that they have special interests that they look after. And the Liberal Party looks after the big end of town. I mean the big end. Don't worry about small business. We get words, but we don't get any concrete benefits. Benefits will go to the big end of town, and you never find out about the deals. Tony Abbott was biased towards the big end of town, which is his backbone of his party, and he certainly brought in some initiatives to try and rein in the debt, raise expenditure, cut spending, and he was literally howled out. And the media take on it all was not only that. You see, what happens when people have had benefits for years and years and years, they stop seeing it as a gift from the taxpayer, and they start seeing it as their right. And when you try to say that's over, it's the end of the world. We've got a crazy instance going here now, which you'll enjoy, that the Labor government wanted to bring in a carbon tax. We had the greatest, look at this from Janet Christopherson, went to boardroom auction last night, 1.5 bedrooms, 1980 in a hovel, went for $1.6 million with a heritage overlay in Melbourne. Yeah, it's just crazy, Janet. And you know, that's right, we're hearing these stories all the time. Just crazy. You interrupted me. I'm sorry, I was interested in what Janet had to say. So this debt thing just goes on and on and on, and the whole point is that governments have outsourced their obligation to manage the economy to the central banks. It's the central banks. They're all quasi-independent, or most of them are in fact legally independent. The Fed Reserve in America is owned by the big merchant banks, the big investment banks. The governments no longer have that responsibility, and this has allowed them to just go on and on and on, bearing in mind the self-interest thing, that let's just do the rubbishy things that make us popular and let's give lip service to everything else, but no one's going to really deal with this issue. So if you don't deal with an issue in economic terms, eventually it will have to deal with itself. And that's why I wanted to, that's the message behind this webinar today, that we have all of these storm clouds gathering, and we're getting to a stage now I think we need to start thinking seriously about this debt problem and the associated income problem. Here's a statement from Australia's Treasurer Scott Morrison, which came out yesterday. This is all from the Sydney Morning Herald, one of Australia's 3 leading newspapers. Sydney Morning Herald and The Age are owned by the Fairfax Group. The other group, of course, is Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. We have them both here, very dominant players in the Australian media industry. And one's as bad as the other, frankly. But this is his statement. The period of this term, that's this term of Parliament, could well prove to be the tipping point on the trajectory of debt our children and grandchildren will be saddled with, adding that once debt reached a critical mass, servicing it would overwhelm other priorities, with debt building its own momentum, which would only grow more difficult to tame. Now, this is a country that is considered to be not highly geared. We don't have a high government debt relative to GDP, but the measurements that we're using for all of this stuff have largely been outdated. When you look at GDP, I don't want to bore you with a lot of economic gobbledygook. I'll try and put it in everyday terms. But gross domestic product in Australia looks okay. That's the traditional measurement of the production of the economy. And the figures out last week, it looks okay. What doesn't get any attention is the growth or otherwise in net income. And that's what affects you and affects me and affects everyone, or almost everyone, those who are not insulated from it. And net available income in all of our countries, Australia, New Zealand, US, and indeed Europe, net income is actually dropping. Australia and New Zealand are actually in an income recession. Income has been declining for the last 4 quarters, and the money you're getting available to you is less than it used to be. And with real household inflation, which is never published, which is running north of 10 or 12%, your money just doesn't go as far. So if you're not feeling as rich as you thought you were, don't be surprised. We all have this issue that, you know, we think our personal thoughts are so personal and apply to us only, but time and again we find that, in fact, we're sharing these thoughts and these feelings with, you know, a whole big crowd of people. And whilst GDP looks okay in Australia, net incomes are falling and have been falling for the last 4 quarters. Same thing's been happening in America, same thing's happening in New Zealand, same thing's happening in Europe. And it's a big problem because these are countries that are highly, highly geared. Consumers need to be able to have the funds to service their commitments. Most of them are still trying to happily take on new commitments. And unless there's growth in income, you can't do that. And if we were to focus on net income instead of this GDP, which is pretty much a phony measure now, we might get a great deal more urgency out of our politicians. An interesting example I heard last night from a very smart young economist. He was talking about how GDP fails to capture what's happening in economies, and he gave the example of how technology is changing so fast that it's changing all sorts of things that used to happen in our economies that we think we understand. And he gave the example of photography. And he said, back in the day, you'd go to the chemist, or we call a pharmacist, or a drugstore, if you like. You'd buy your film for your camera. It was reasonably expensive. You'd put it in your camera. You'd go out. You'd take some careful photos because this cost you some money. And then when you'd filled up the film, you'd take it out. You'd drive down to the pharmacy or your photo shop, and you'd pay to get these film developed and printed onto cardboard stock. And then presumably you'd go and pick up those films, developed films, and you'd buy a photo album, and you'd put the photos in your photo album. Now, all of those steps, from going to the pharmacy to buy your film, to taking your photos, to having them developed, to having the prints printed, having the negative developed and the films printed, to going and picking those up, to buying your photo album. All of that is economic activity, including the trips to and from the film shops. All of that is economic activity that used to be captured by GDP. Now it's gone. Everybody has smartphones. They take not carefully considered one or two photos, just take photos all the time. There's no direct cost of taking photos. There's no direct cost of storing photos on your iPhone, your smartphone. Have as many as you like. People are just, clicking away constantly. And GDP doesn't capture that because there's no economic activity, measurable economic activity there. So this argument's about looking at these older-fashioned modes of measuring the economy are failing because technology has changed so much of it. And I want to push the argument that we should be saying to our politicians, you've got to be thinking in terms of available income. That's what matters to us. That's what matters to everyone on the planet, whether you're a business owner or working for someone else. It's the available income in your hands, your disposable income. That's the big thing that's not talked about. And we look at how this is going to develop. Another statement from the Treasurer today in his statement is that almost 50% of the Australian working population do not pay any income tax. That is under our system of benefits from government for having children, for childcare, education, welfare, single mothers benefits, everything else. They either don't have taxable income, or they get, after they've netted off the benefits they get back from the government, they're paying nil effective income. In other words, the tax they pay is not greater than the benefits they receive back. So almost 50% of the working population pays no tax. Okay, and I know that that's a very similar situation in America. Then let's look at the other end of town. Let's look at how this problem stacks up. The big end of town, the ATO, the Australian Taxation Office, says 30% of large private companies pay no tax. And they define large companies as companies with more than 200 million turnover. The largest was the West Australian Grain Handling Cooperative. It paid no company tax on more than 3.4 billion in revenue. I don't expect people outside Australia and New Zealand to know these names. It doesn't matter. They're just examples for you of large, well-known privately owned Australian companies. Pratt Consolidated Holdings, it makes cardboard boxes. It's the dominant player in that space, very, very profitable. $2.5 billion in revenue, no tax. Hoyt, a big theatre group here, 400 million in gross earnings, no tax. McDonald's, can you believe it? They only declared 478 million in revenue. That must be a net figure. No tax. Yeah, I mean, yeah. And I'm an attorney, and I've been an attorney now for, believe it or not, 50 years. And I used to do a lot of tax when I was practicing law. But you've just got to say, and understand why these people don't have to pay tax. I know all the set-offs and the set-up costs and the way they've leveraged their overseas countries to put huge amounts of debt on these companies and deduct the interest rates. And then, of course, you've got the Ubers and Googles and Microsofts who are incorporated in foreign jurisdictions with no or very low tax and claim that that's their business there, even though Uber cars are rolling around Australia and Google is accessed in Australia. Tax, no tax. The big end of town is not paying its share of tax. The small end of town, the bottom 50%, is paying no tax. 30% of these large private companies are not paying any tax either. Then let's go on to the big companies, local and foreign-based, big ones, not the private companies. 597 local and foreign-based companies. They had a combined turnover of $406 billion. They had a taxable income of $4 billion. Let's have a look at some of the biggies. Transfield, the biggest heavy construction company in this part of the world, $2.8 billion. Had a taxable income of only 16 million, which would be a joke, and zero tax. Chevron, who you all know, $3 billion turnover, no tax. CSL, Colonial Sugar Limited, it's the monopoly sugar provider. Australia's a big grower of sugar cane. 2.1 billion turnover, 160 million in taxable income, and paid zero tax. Fairfax Media, the publishers of The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, 1.7 billion in turnover, 70 million in net income, and paid 16% tax, and that's just crazy. Macquarie Investment Bank, 8.1 billion turnover, 127 million tax. It's just absurd. And Peter says that's hard to believe this is equitable. Well, it's not equitable, but no one's focused on it. This is the front page, folks, of today's Sydney Morning Herald, one of our two biggies, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, our sister publications, also the Brisbane Times, the three big capital cities in Australia, are all served by the same group, Fairfax Media. The other group is the Australian Rupert Murdoch's group. And these are the headlines. This is what was on the front page today. Decision Mike Baird dreads is his toughest test. He's the Premier of New South Wales, the state. They liked it. Teenage pregnancy program has reverse effect. Getting snapped up. Sydney property market gets a boost. Mother was grooming me to be a prostitute. You think I'm joking? This is the front page of one of the two most important newspapers in the country. France defends bikini ban as global backlash grows. Bishop, that's Julie Bishop, she's the Assistant Prime Minister. Revelations over Chinese Liberal donors. Binging on BMWs as overall living standards fall. Shaking with anger. Work dried up after teacher's admission to boss. And this is what people are reading. This is the front page. And it's extraordinary. There's just no discussion. We've become a nation of bogans. You won't know what that word means. But we have children having children, is how I explain it. Young people with bad manners having children and raising their children with bad manners. But there is just no concern. Try to get people to focus on the problems that we're facing and the necessity for reform. The chances of that are zilch. And the newspapers are driven by their mission, which is to sell newspapers. They don't want to go into all this heavy-duty stuff that I'm talking to you about. They're just there to sell newspapers. And here's our chart, which you haven't seen for a while, but I've been showing it to you since 2007. This is the US T-bonds, 30-year T-bonds, and of course the market in T-bonds is the inverse of interest rates. So as this market goes up, it means interest rates are going down. And in particular, you can see the last one of the recent points on this chart where the US Fed announced it was actually going to start raising rates. And look what's happened. And this is now for the first time, this market, this is a 24-day chart. This is a Daniel Code trading month, if you like. And for the last 2.5 months, this market has been trading at greater than 3 standard deviations from the mean, and that is unsustainable. When, we don't know, but it just continues to get sillier and sillier. Here's all of this is from the Wall Street Journal today. For those of you who haven't read it, you're comfortably numb, Pete. That's quite right. This is the US Fed today. In the 1990s, a period known in economics as the Great Moderation. I read an article about that. It sounded to me like the Great Stupidity. It seemed the Fed could do no wrong. Policymakers and voters saw it as a machine with buttons officials could push to heat or cool the economy as needed. Well, that's gone now. We've spent all of that, you see. The ammo has gone. Fed's just firing blanks now. You can't take the interest rates down any lower in the US, and marginally, what is a quarter of 1 point matter when they're down at a half. Same in Australia and New Zealand. The next quarter point makes no difference at all. That's gone. This is the next statement from Eric Rosengren. He's the president of the Fed Reserve in Boston. There are a lot of things that we thought we knew that haven't turned out quite as we expected. The economy and financial markets are not as stable as we previously assumed. Well, you know, that's a pretty transparent sort of an argument, because the reason that these markets have been recovering so well since 2009 and now have been for a while at all-time highs is because of the juice the Fed's been putting into them. So the Fed knows full well that the supposed stability of the markets now are like a junkie on speed. They've just got to get more and more hits to keep it going. And that's the problem we're going to see when we look at the charts, that these markets are stalling out. And there's going to be, I think, a reasonably serious correction, which we'll get to. The next statement, this is from Janet Yellen, the chairwoman of the Fed. I certainly myself couldn't have imagined 6-7 years ago that we would be employing the policies we are now. And that's the really scary thing, these ultra-low interest rate policies, what the Fed calls accommodative. This was supposed to be a short-term sugar hit. It's now become the norm. And there's so much leveraged debt sitting on it that the world, including the Fed, is terrified that any attempts to normalize interest rates are going to crash the markets, and they certainly are. Warren Buffett's famous quotation, everyone looks good when the tide's in, but when the tide goes out, you can see who's been swimming naked. And there's just a whole lot of corporations and a whole lot of individuals who are over their heads in debt. Income's static or negative. It's not growing the way debt's been growing. Any increase in interest rates, they're not going to be able to service these debts. In fact, they're not going to even have to worry, because the panic is going to be so great that the markets will crash all on their own. However, the question is, does any political animal have the will to do this? I don't see any on the horizon. The final quote here comes from Larry Summers. Those of you a bit older will remember Larry when he was chairman of the Fed. We should be extremely worried. We are essentially on a fairly dangerous battlefield with very little ammunition, and that's right. So finally, for this part of the presentation, and we have a lot more to go yet, folks, I wanted to show you our compliance statement, as I always do, that trading futures and commodities has risk involved. And if you haven't learned the Daniel Code way of trading safely and profitably, it has more risk than you can possibly imagine. So I do beg all of you be careful. Learn to trade before you stick the toe in. It's very easy to lose money trading if you don't know what you're doing. Okay, let's move on and have a look at the charts. I've got quite a few to show you. Let's look at our biggies here. And I wanted to start by showing you the summer doldrums. What most of you, if you don't live in Europe, don't know is that Europe has this culture of summer holidays. And virtually the whole of Europe goes on holidays for the summer, all of Western Europe. In France, they have 8 9 weeks off to laze around in the sun, drink vino, eat croissants, lie around on the beach. Wonderful. Wish I was part of it. And for even the Teutonic Germans will have 6 weeks over the summer holidays. And virtually whole government departments closed, just go to skeleton staff. Whole cities and towns are virtually closed down. This is a universal thing, and this is what's known in the markets as the summer doldrums. And typically it's second half of July, all of August. Sometimes a few of the better people, the French in particular, will push that out through the early weeks of September. And this is what we've been having in markets during this period. And I want to just run through a number of markets. I've got 9 Forex markets to show you before we move on to commodities. And for a lot of you people I know trading Forex, your market selection is vital. And sometimes it's not apparent to see what the problem is. But this, very popular, the Aussie USD market and the Aussie JPY. They're not great trading markets, folks, apart from the obvious fact I've made here that the market closed today at exactly the same level it did on June the 23rd. Have a look at these coloured bars in here. The red bars are inside bars. They're bars wholly inside the previous bar, and the outside bars, which are the real killers, are outside the previous bar. And typically these outside bars can elect a sell signal and then go back with the trend, which in this case is up. Here's the second time it does it. Here's the third time it does it. And this whole run up from July the 22nd to August the 10th, which looked okay, there are 1, 2, 3 outside bars in there, which shock the losses on the outside bar. Even if you do the stop and reverse, will just suck out all of your profits. And look down here in particular. I put on here the average true range. I want you to just see this phenomenon. This average true range, the daily range. This is a 29 period. You can add this. It's a standard tool in all charting packages. You can make it shorter or longer, but this volume, the average trading range, I should say, the close minus the open, has absolutely fallen off the cliff. And this is happening across so many markets. That's Aussie USD. This is the Canadian JPY, the loonie. Look at this average true range. It's just down the toilet. And have a look at the way this market's been trading. This market has simply been consolidating since August the 2nd. Pretty well the whole month now. It's just gone sideways. And 1 in outside bar, 2 outside bars doesn't help. Was a nice little move up here, but the outside bars would have killed it. Next market to look at, Euro GBP. Same thing. Look at this big sideways consolidation here, and look at all the outside bars stuck in here. 4 of them. Not nice. And these are the markets. You've got to be very careful, folks, with your market selection. You want to be trading markets that are moving and have some dynamic feature to them. That's what makes trading profitable, amongst other things. These are the worst of them. Euro GBP, Euro JPY, very, very popular market to trade. Have a look at this. I mean, this market, talk about the doldrums. This market has just been absolutely sideways since August. Not much better through here. This was the result. This is Brexit. This huge, huge bar here. This is Brexit. And then this market was shocked. It's taken some while to find some balance. Now it simply died. Euro JPY, that was that one. Next one is going to be GBP Chief. Same thing. Here's Brexit. comes up, rallies, this goes sideways. You've talked about this before. At tutorials, I always show you the big sell-off in oil and what happened for the month of September 2015, just sideways. It's a market trying to find its balance, but it's not a good trading market. And in this period, 1, 2, 3, 4 outside bars, the killer of profitable trading, outside bars. And they happen really when there's no momentum. They're more prone to happen when there's no real momentum. GBP, JPY, dreadful market to trade. Look what's happening with this average true range. I mean, it's just off the cliff. Yes, it's down. It's not bugged with so many outside bars, but boy, this is not a good trading market. GBP, GBP, USD, same thing. All of these markets. Look at this. Here's your Brexit crash. This market's in extreme stress, extreme shock. It's essentially gone sideways since June the 28th, and it's peppered with outside bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 outside bars in that period. Last couple I want to show you. New Zealand JPY, same thing. Look at what's happening here. Average true range falling off a cliff. That's your profit. You know, if it can't move its daily range, you can't make money. It just doesn't go up fast enough. And again, peppered with outside bars. 1, 2, 3, 4. Same story there. This market is notorious. I know a lot of you trade this. This is not a good trading market, folks. It will be when it breaks out to the downside, but you've got these huge patches of consolidations here, and this is what kills your trading, being in the wrong market. So I want you to really think about your market selection. That was USD JPY is the last one to look at. Another bad one here. Look at this. Same thing. This is your Brexit. Big rally afterwards. All of this was fun. We traded all of this. Starting to come down. Now you've got it going down in this stair-step pattern. There is no momentum. A lot of this. There's one step which doesn't want to stay there. He's jumped off altogether. There he is there, and here's the next one you can see pretty obviously. There's no profit in these trades. There is a good buy trade in here, but only for about 3 days. Then you get 2 days down, outside bar. Okay, so your market selection is vital. Try to trade markets that are vibrant, that are moving. This big fall, I know I'm down all through this period, average true range was low, but it's this pattern of it diving off the cliff, which is a warning to you. You can see this big dive went down here, and since then this has just been totally moribund. They're bad trading markets, and try and avoid those, folks, because in the extreme case, no matter what you do, you can't win. There is not enough volatility in the market to get you where you want to go. Okay, let's have a look now at some longer term charts and see what's coming up. This is our 24-day chart. This is gold. I'm just making the point here. Gold rallied. We're going to look gold in a weekly chart as well. Straight up to its Daniel code number 1372.6. These are 6-day charts. These are 24-day charts. Our monthly chart. You see that these markets are completely contained by these Daniel code numbers. The Daniel code blue lines and red lines define all markets. And the greatest truism in business is if you can't measure it, you can't fix it. And your trading's the same. If you can't anchor your charts with the Daniel code numbers and have a realistic appraisal of the probabilities of what markets will do, you're just not going to be able to improve your trading. So, okay, Hugh lost sound for a bit. Sorry about that, Hugh. It's actually not me. It's just we're a very, very long way away, all of us. And the wonders of technology allow me to speak to you. So let's move on to our big concerns here. This is the S&P. This is the 24-day chart of the S&P. Here's our Here's our 2009 crash low. We thought that was a crash, folks. Have a look at that. Doesn't look too savage now, does it? But look at what we've got in front of us. And one of the levels that I had on this chart was 2195.91. This is the index, incidentally. This is the monthly chart, and the high to date's been 2193.81, getting awfully close to that blue line. That's not a normal Daniel code blue line, but it's an extension of the previous range using 1.593, or one of the Daniel code most prominent Daniel code ratios. This is a prime spot for this market to fail. And I just want you to be aware and be on alert, more than usual alert. Of course, we don't jump in and throw our hands in the air and say the end is nigh. We don't know when the end of this bull market will come. There'll be plenty of people who will tell you that this whole consolidation since January is just a wave 4 and it's got a whole new leg up to go. Well, maybe, but the probabilities are against that. And as rational people, you need to be aware 2195 is important resistance, and we're just about there now, if not already there. So I wanted to show you that. This is the worry. We're hitting some very, very important resistance levels, and on the smaller scale, you don't see it on this chart, we're running out of momentum. Momentum is stalling. A lot of it is to do with this market here, which many of you wanted to see. This is the US dollar index. I've shown you this chart many times before. Like all other charts, it's simply ruled by the Daniel code. It ran up to this Daniel code retracement here at 100.84. High was 178.5, and it's now finding support just below this 93.405. That's the range it's oscillating in. If you really sit back and have a look at this market, you can see that this has had a very, very significant run up since 2008. And this is entirely ruled by government policy, folks. What happens to this market? And I don't think the Fed is too thrilled about the US dollar appreciating anything above 100.84. We've seen that number tested and rejected a couple of times now. So the probability is that this market drifts a little bit lower. You notice that the US Treasury's taken a much tougher line against Japan, who are the most serial manipulators of their currency in the world. That's done purely for commercial reasons, of course. But I think interesting that US Treasury's got tough with Japan now. I suspect this market won't appreciate very much. And then let's have a look, moving on from this. We had a quick look at gold, didn't tell us a lot. Let's go to the 6-day charts now, and here is the S&P, which has been, and this is a different way of looking at markets. This market is now at all-time highs, but if you look at this on the angle or the fourth degree way of looking at charts, you can see that it broke down, and we got the one failure signal here, which was back on the next week to that. There you are. It never goes the one you want it to. February the 10th, I talked to you about that, the webinar, and said what happens from here is that we get a correction or a large consolidation. And what we're actually having now is a large consolidation. I know the market's making new highs, but these are not, in my view, breakout highs. This is a pattern of consolidation, which is setting up a number of significant failure points. We can look also to show you this is a universal problem. This is AP. This is the Australian Share Price Index. This is the Australia's equivalent of the S&P, if you like. It's doing the same thing. This darker line is the median of the index. It fell down to 1 standard deviation from the mean, then 2 standard deviations from the mean, couple of breaks of that and a rapid recovery, and it's clawing back now, trying get back to 1 standard deviation from the mean. Here's the next one to look at. This is the Russell, which we know is the Fed's preferred index to boost, and here it is. You see exactly the same situation here. This stronger line is the median. The dotted line extends it. Break of 1, break of 2. This is more extreme. Break of 3 standard deviations from the mean, which means the party's over unless you get an instant reverse, which it's done, and it's now fought its way all the way back to 1 standard deviation from the mean, and this is a prime spot for markets to fail. This is exactly what we had at the 2007 top. So be aware that we need to bring a higher level of awareness to our trading, and particularly be aware you don't have to take anything from this. You don't have to make any new decisions. All you have to do is follow the Daniel Code daily signals. They'll pull you into the trades. We can't trade these 6-day, 12, 24-day charts because the risk on these bars is too big to trade futures. But I think that enough markets now are right at points that are prime for failure. I think that I don't know when this debt problem is going to blow up. It can't be resolved. I mean, all that the governments and the central banks are going to do is kick the can. There's now not the political will, particularly in America right now. In the middle of an election campaign, there is no political will to do anything unpopular. Australia's got a government with a hair of majority. It's certainly not going to undertake anything courageous, and that's what we require. We require our politicians to have courage, and the world is replete with examples, including Tony Abbott, of what happens when you try to bring the courage to do the things that really need to be done. Whether you agree with the bloke or not doesn't matter. The fact is he's the only politician in recent times who's prepared to take a carving knife to debt, and he was summarily chucked out by his own party, driven by the media. Yes, Albert, the markets are all controlled. They must maintain control until after the election. If there is a crash, Trump will win. Well, Trump might win anyway, but I certainly agree with you, mate, there. So, but be aware, it's enough here to look at to give you some pause and some concern. And we need to be just more acutely aware of downside risk than we normally are. And as you know, I'm not a panic merchant. I managed to get from 2009 all the way through, I think that's probably the last bull, right through until February 2016, saying there's no sell signals, there's no reason to worry about this. And in February, I told you that was the first sign that trouble may be coming. And I think while the trend is still up, we need to be doubly aware that we're exposed to some dangerous forces. And I think that's about all I have for you today, folks. It's a beautiful Friday morning down here in Brisbane. Sun's shining. Spring is starting. Looked pretty nice. And it's time to go and sit by the pool and have a couple of Bloody Marys and consider the fate of the world. So thank you for being with me today. I hope some of the stuff we've talked about has been beneficial to you. I hope I didn't get in too deeply to the problems we have, but remember that most of the world are bastards and politicians are leading the crowd. They don't have they're sensible people. They're not going to do what's required because they know they'll be hoofed out of office, and we just simply don't have any leaders of the caliber to put the greater good of the country before themselves, and that applies all over the world. So the next time you hear a politician say to another one, "Thank you for your service," I invite you to vomit in the pavement, which is what I usually do. Okay, folks, thanks for being with us today. Glad you're enjoying it. Everyone's enjoying it. Johnny Barnes, Peter, Don. Great. and Pete loved to squeeze some tomatoes. That sounds fun, mate. Enjoy the Bloody Marys. Have a couple of me. Good on you. Marv, come and see me at tutorial someday. What's Pete like? Keeping Lynn getting worried it'd be a 30% correction in farm values. This is my mate Pete in New Zealand. He knows all about this. Could be a 30% correction in farm values. What will that do to the Big Four capital ratio? It'll wipe them out. They either won't allow it to happen or they'll have to hide it. Yeah, go for the Bloody Marys. The margarita's a bit sophisticated for me. Thanks. Just straight on the Bloody Marys. Akshay, my friend. Good, Mark. Sue, thank you. Sue, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Okay, folks, that's it for me. I'm off to the sit in the sun and have the drink and think about the marvellous of my mate Rob Fadge from New Zealand. Now go and let the cat out of the bag, John. Well, you know, Rob, we've been talking about this for how long? But we've just been talking about it amongst ourselves quietly. But I think it's getting to the stage now that there are going to be some real consequences, and the governments are just literally incapable of fixing these issues. It'll be all sound bites and little words, but nothing done. This will go on until it can no longer go on, and then it will end. Okay, bit more Tabasco. Yeah, All Blacks. Yes, they will. My Daryl, God, Daryl, Mustang and Sage. All of you folks who are rugby mad like me, Daryl's got tickets to the All Blacks match at the Cake Tin in Wellington on Saturday. The All Blacks are playing the second test against the Wallabies, and you'll see Daryl sitting there with his All Blacks jacket on, his beanie. I'm green with envy, mate. I wish I was with you. Have fun and be as bad as you can, folks, and I'll talk to you at the next webinar, which will be in a fortnight's time, if not before. So thank you for being with me today. Bye-bye.